Beneath the whitewash of polite society, the lowcountry carried secrets like silt in its tides. They sank deep and never rose again. Not on maps, not in courtrooms, not in the comfortable parlors where men in starch collars planned crops and marriages and the purchase of human lives. It was in that quiet, in the long shadow of live oaks and rice levees, that one woman arrived with storm water in her hair and a calm in her hands that would not be broken. They called her Isabella dos Santos when she first stepped onto Carolina soil, a name given to her by the auctioneer's ledger and the man who crossed the paper with a pen. In the language of the ship that had carried her, she had another name. A name with rhythm and lineage, a name that traced back to a village where elders kept memory as carefully as they kept fire. That name did not survive the market. The one that did would make history in ways her captors could never imagine. It was the summer of 1716, and the tide was low enough to smell the mud flats. The estates along the river presented themselves like stage sets. Manicured banks, slave quarters tacked at the edges, and grand houses that looked out over water like judges looking down from the bench. One of those houses, a manor of pale bricks and proud chimneys, belonged to Jonathan Merritt, a second-generation planter whose name was carved into ledgers and the mouths of the colony's elite. Merritt was known for his precision. In accounts, in rifles, in punishments. Men who ran plantations like his believed the world bent to practical calculations. Human beings were input and output. They never accounted for patience. Isabella was assigned to Merritt's main house as a house slave. Food, cleaning, passing wine between men who made laws of their own. She watched them with the stillness of someone who had learned early that the sharpest edges could be survived by not meeting them head-on. She watched not because she wanted to, but because survival demanded knowledge. Names, timetables, habits, jokes disguised as strategy. She collected them like tiny coals, letting them cool until they were useful. The most dangerous men gathered monthly in Merritt's dining room. 14 of them, a private circle that handled shipping, pricing, and the machinery of slavery across 4 counties. They called themselves the River Consortium and treated the business of human lives like accounts in a ledger. Inputs, depreciation, gross profit. Isabella served at their meetings, refilling glasses, polishing forks, absorbing patterns. Who arrived by noon, whose cough meant a weak heart, who excused himself when conversation turned to breeding stock or discipline. From the kitchen's margins she learned their rhythms, and in the ethics-free air of their banter she learned what they would not boast of publicly, what they could not see, because they were too busy being gods within a narrow horizon, was the long memory Isabella carried beneath her ribs. Before the sea took her and the auction split kin from kin, she had been schooled by women and men who taught her not only how to read weather and root, but how to temper fire and tincture. She had seen invaders torch a village. She had smelled the iron tang of fear thick enough to salivate like blood. Her grandmother had taught her the subtle art of making a bitter herb sweet to the tongue, how to brew sleep from leaf and root, and how to count the turn of a man's breath to know when he would sleep for a long time. For 10 years she leaned into the kitchen's routines and disguised study as duty. She improved knives, learned the quirks of the great iron furnace in Merritt's scullery, and practiced the slow temperature climbs it required to blister bone from meat without burning pots. The furnace was a wonder to the planter class, an imported beast of brick and iron that could hold a heat far beyond the common hearth. Merritt showed it off, bragging about its capacity over brandy and laughter. He boasted over its specs to Johns in other counties. The planter class admired equipment as proof of civilization. They failed to recognize that equipment could be turned back upon them. Isabella's life changed on a day that the river tore away something else. A rumor of cargo, a ship's manifest mentioning a shipment of young men and women bound for work in a neighboring parish. Among those names, listed as lots and lots numbers, was the one she loved. Matu, a strong-shouldered field hand who read letters stolen at night and taught others in secret, was listed as sold. The ledger entry was a razor across the quiet she had held for years. In the economy that treated human beings as fleet assets, his sale meant the dismantling of a network of hope they had built. Safe houses, word routes, the faint, dangerous maps of escape. That night, beneath a sky smeared with marshlight and mosquito sound, Isabella moved. She met Matu at the old oyster tree where the slaves traded notes beneath the stars. He had a plan. A ship captain who would take 2 of them south to Spanish ports, a chance to breathe free air. He wanted to take what he could and run. His voice trembled like a drawn bow at the thought of leaving a plan that could free more than two. But the risk, he said, was too great and the timeline too tight. Isabella listened, and as she listened something inside folded into itself like embers banked for winter. Running would spare them. It would also let the men of the River Consortium go on, their system untouched. The sale would continue. More names would be written and erased. In the space between the river and the rice fields, she felt a choice sharpen. The private escape, or a blow that would echo. She returned to the kitchen the next day as if nothing had happened. She worked with hands that hid an incandescent plan. For months she had been stockpiling. Coal in a hidden room, scrap iron files, a careful mapping of chamber doors and servant routes. She had observed which of the 14 men loosened their belts after midnight and which preferred the brandy chilled a degree colder. She had mapped the timetables with the devotion of someone memorizing a hymn. She had been patient long enough to be invisible. On the afternoon of June 24th, a date that would later be whispered and then officially buried, the River Consortium gathered at Merritt's house for a meeting of commerce and contempt. They arrived in carriages that threw up dust on the road and smelled of boots and business. Each man took his customary place at the table. The judge who spoke law like scripture, the trader who grinned at human auctions, the physician who kept the men alive just long enough to profit. They joked about ships and breeding programs, poked fun at one another's wives, and spoke casually of women and children as items in inventory. Isabella moved among them like smoke, pouring wine and lighting cigars, cataloging every moment. When the house settled into that soft, stupid confidence only privilege breeds, Isabella made her move. Her plan was not the frantic chaos of a simple revolt. It was deliberate and severe in its logic. Take the instruments of power and show them the experience of helplessness they had so carefully designed for others. She dosed decanters with an herb that mimicked sleep but left the mind intact. She placed shackles where they would be discovered and used them as restraint. She prepared the furnace to be more than a cooking tool, making it a slow, labeled lesson in consequence. She did not seek quick death. She intended time. Hours enough for thought, for memory, for reckoning. When the men slipped into unconsciousness, one by one, she worked with the patient, exact hands of someone who had learned to measure life in teaspoons. Fastening iron, stuffing cotton in mouths to muffle the panic, arranging their bodies in a ring around the furnace's blazing maw. Not one of them raised more than a dull, desperate sound when they returned to awareness. The mixture left them aware and trapped, and that awareness was the engine of what would come next. Isabella sat in a corner of the scullery, knives honed and eyes steady. She spoke in the languages of her past and present. Portuguese, Kimbundu, and the stilted English she had perfected. And she spoke not as a hunter but as an archivist, reciting names, dates, and cruelties with a voice that did not tremble. Each recollection was a mirror held up to a man who had never been forced to look. She told them of families sold in nights when they celebrated profit, of children forced into fields before they could walk, of women beaten until the plantation's dogs learned to flinch at the sound of a whip. Her words were not a spectacle. They were the ledger of memory returned to its authors. Dawn would find the house changed. Merritt's estate would become a place of rumor and rage, and for years the official records would be sealed away by men in office, uncomfortable with the poetic kind of justice that could not be reconciled with balance sheets. But that morning, in the hush before the cooks arrived and the overseers noticed, Isabella closed her journal of deeds with hands reddened in a way that was not law's blood. She had chosen to carve a message into the mind of a plantation class that thought itself invulnerable. She left the house as quietly as she had entered it years before, not fleeing but moving on, the river taking her image away from the bricks. In the kitchens and quarters, whispers started like steam. A name uttered under breath, a date, a wound. Later, historians would argue about exact sequences. Governors would lock files and mutter about scandal and reputation. But in the muddy alleyways and under the low eaves of slave cabins, the story passed in the rhythm of a chant. The river's daughter had stoked a furnace and taught men what being owned feels like when the owners owe no mercy. The sun never saw what happened inside the Merritt plantation that night. The shutters were closed, the thick curtains pulled, and the heavy air of the Carolina lowlands seemed to hold its breath. The only light came from the furnace, a roaring, pulsing thing that glowed like the open throat of hell itself. The men of the river consortium, the so-called masters of trade in flesh, lay bound in their own dining room, each man's hands tied behind his back with the same hemp rope they used to bind the enslaved. Their fine coats, gold buttons, and smug faces glistened in the heat. When consciousness returned, it did not arrive kindly. They awoke in confusion first, the fog of Isabella's herbal draught wearing off in slow waves. Then came the pain. Wrists chafing, heads pounding, and the realization that something was terribly wrong. Jonathan Merritt, the master of the house, was the first to stir. He blinked toward the furnace, its flames reflecting in his wine glass that now lay shattered near his chair. Who did this?" he rasped, voice dry from the drug. From the far end of the room, Isabella answered, calm, clear, and steady. "The same hands that served you supper, Master Merritt, the same eyes that watched you measure a life's worth by the pound." Her voice carried no tremor. It was neither vengeance nor rage. It was record. The others began to twist and pull at their bonds, chairs scraping the polished floor. The scent of smoke and sweat mingled with the perfume of spilled brandy. Each man saw what they'd never imagined. Themselves powerless, property in another's hands. Merritt's old friend, Judge William Carter, wheezed through his mustache. "Untie us this instant, girl. Do you know what they'll do to you?" Isabella tilted her head slightly. "Do you?" she said softly. "Do you remember what you did to Isaac Rowe's daughter when she ran from your court? You sent her back to the field. Lashes first, rope after." Carter's face went red. He cursed, his voice breaking with both fury and shame. Isabella moved between them like a spirit, silent except for the rustle of her skirt. She carried a small book, a handmade ledger of sorts, its pages filled with careful handwriting, names and dates, the writing of someone who had learned to record pain in ink. "This," she said, opening the book, "is what you never thought anyone would remember." She read the entries aloud, each one a moment stolen from a life. June 1709. Eliza, 12 years old, sold with her mother. Returned missing her tongue for speaking back. October 1713. Samuel, beaten to death by overseer's cane. No burial, recorded as lost property. February 1715. Child unnamed, born and buried the same night. Each line was met with silence. Even the furnace seemed to pause between its breaths. "Those are lies," shouted Edwin Harrow, the ship merchant whose family grew rich trafficking bodies down the coast. "Lies?" Isabella echoed, her eyes dark as river mud. "Then why does your signature appear beside each entry in Merritt's accounts? You wrote the prices, Mr. Harrow. You know the worth of flesh better than any man here." She stepped closer to him. The firelight carved her face into planes of gold and shadow. "Tell me," she whispered, "how much is a heartbeat worth when it's not your own?" No one answered. Outside, crickets sang their steady song, oblivious to the reckoning inside. The air was thick enough to drink. Then, from behind the table, Dr. Henry Caldwell, the plantation's physician, spoke in a low, trembling tone. You don't understand, woman. I was following orders. The laws." Isabella turned sharply toward him. "Laws written by who? By you. By them." She gestured around the table. "You called cruelty a system and gave it letters and seals. You gave it language so that men could pretend they were not killing, only conducting business." Her words landed like stones on a coffin. She reached into a clay bowl by the furnace, scooping a handful of ash, black, soft and fine. "This," she said, "is the only law that remains. Everything burns the same." The men began to beg then. Promises, bribes, prayers, each one offered in the same trembling voice that they had once ignored from those beneath them. "Please, Miss Isabella," whimpered Thomas Gray, the youngest of the consortium. "If you spare me, I can help you escape. There's money." She smiled faintly. "You think this is about escape?" She placed a metal brand, the same used on livestock, into the furnace's mouth. The iron began to glow, slowly turning from black to orange. The sight made every man's pulse race. "This brand marked every back on this plantation," she said. her tone measured. The letter M. For merit. For ownership. She lifted it with iron tongs, holding it steady in the heat shimmer. Now it will mark something else, an ending. The men screamed. Some prayed. Some cursed. Isabella didn't touch them with it. Instead, she pressed it against the table itself, the fine imported with searing smoke curling upward. When she pulled it back, the M burned deep into the surface. A scar across the table where so many cruelties had been planned. That, she said, is where your names end. The rest belongs to the river. For hours she spoke, not shouting, not pleading, but teaching. She recited each of their crimes, each act of cruelty passed down like inheritance. She made them listen as she described how the enslaved had buried their dead, how songs were used to map escape routes, how hope refused to die even when bodies did. She told them about the language they could not hear, the prayers whispered in dialects they mocked, the signs carved into trees, the secret unity they mistook for obedience that it was not revenge. It was history finally being read aloud to its authors. When dawn began to pale the windows, Isabella's eyes had not softened, but her breathing slowed. The men were silent now. Too drained to speak, too shamed to meet her gaze, she walked to Merritt last. His hair clung to his forehead with sweat, his face a mask of disbelief. "You think this will change anything?" he rasped. "They'll hang you, they'll bury you nameless, and in a year they'll forget." Isabella leaned close. "Maybe they will, but you won't." She placed her ledger beside him, open to the final page. It read only 4 words, "We remember you too." Then she left him there, alive, but stripped of every illusion of power. To be why the time the servants found the room hours later. The furnace was cold, the bindings loose, and the master's table branded like a tombstone. Isabella was gone. Some said she took a boat downriver toward the Spanish territories. Others said she walked into the marshes and vanished. But those who worked the fields whispered something different. That when the river fog rises just before dawn, a woman can be seen walking its banks, silent, barefoot, carrying a small book of names. They called her a Filha do Rio, the river's daughter, and from that day on, no master in that county ever slept soundly again. By morning, the Merritt estate was silent. The fields, normally alive with the sound of iron and command, were still. Even the overseers seemed unsure of their own authority, standing at the edge of the house yard as if the air itself had changed weight. Smoke still rose from the scullery chimney, but there was no breakfast fire. Only the bitter scent of ash and something metallic. Not quite blood, not quite rust. When the house servants found the dining room, their cries broke the quiet like glass. The River Consortium, those men who had once ruled over 1,000 souls, were found tied, bruised, and shaking. No one had died, but something had. The arrogance that had filled their lungs for decades was gone. What was left were ghosts in living flesh, each one staring at the same brand scorched into the table. The letter M, black and smoking, like a signature from hell itself. Jonathan Merritt said nothing for days. His wife, Elizabeth, ordered the shutters closed and forbade anyone to speak of what had happened. The local magistrates arrived, men who owed their wealth to the same trade, and what followed was a rehearsal of silence. They buried the evidence, sealed the records, and wrote the official report in a language only liars could invent. The document still exists, a brief, bloodless entry in colonial archives. Incident of rebellion. Damage to property. Perpetrator unknown. Matter resolved. Resolved. No mention of Isabella. No mention of the ledger of names. No mention of the night when masters were made to feel the weight of their own cruelty. But history does not keep secrets well. Not when the wind and river remember. The story began to drift beyond the plantation, carried by whispers among the enslaved. At night, when the overseers slept, they repeated her name like prayer. Isabella, the woman who made the masters tremble. The tale spread along the waterways that fed the Carolina coast, carried by fishermen, traders, and fugitives moving by moonlight. Each time it was told, it changed slightly. In one version, she vanished into the river. In another, she became a spirit who haunted the fields where blood had been spilled. By the end of that summer, the butcher of the masters became a phrase the planters dared not say aloud. In Charleston, colonial officials discussed the matter behind closed doors. They feared not just rebellion, but the idea of her. A single woman, unarmed, had undone the illusion of control that their empire depended on. Governor Blakely ordered a quiet investigation. Riders were sent upriver, bounty posters printed with her description. Slave woman, name unknown, light brown complexion, scar on right wrist. Dangerous. Dangerous. They didn't understand that danger was not what she carried. It was what she had returned to them. The militia found nothing. No trace. No body. No footprints. Some said her canoe had been spotted near the marshes of Beaufort, gliding through fog, her face lit by a lantern. Others swore they saw her walking through fields at night, the brand mark glowing faintly beneath her hand. Weeks passed, then months. The Merritt estate began to crumble under its own silence. The rice yields dropped. The workers moved slower. The overseers whispered about seeing the furnace burn on its own. Jonathan Merritt himself never recovered. Servants said he woke screaming, clutching his chest, muttering about the circle and the river. He dismissed half his staff, burned his own ledgers, and forbade anyone to light the scullery furnace again. But even he could not silence what had begun. The enslaved people of neighboring plantations began leaving small offerings near the riverbanks. Shells, feathers, carved pieces of wood, symbols of freedom and remembrance. They called the place the river's mouth, where the water turned dark and slow. A traveling preacher, hearing the stories, wrote in his journal. They say she walks at dawn, a woman dressed in gray, leaving no footprints. Wherever she passes, the dogs refuse to bark. By 1718, the legend had become more than a story. It was a warning, and a promise that in one plantation near Savannah, a group of enslaved women refused to work, standing silently at dawn by the river. When the overseer demanded an explanation, one of them said, "We are waiting for the river's daughter." When he struck her, the whip split midair, the leather snapping clean in half. The man fled, swearing the sound had come from the river itself. From then on, the planters spoke of the river's curse, though the enslaved knew better. It wasn't a curse. It was memory, alive and patient. Years later, when the American Revolution came and the old estates burned, one traveler wrote of visiting the ruins of Merritt's house. He described the table, still marked by the letter M, preserved like an altar to shame. On its surface, someone had carved a single line in Portuguese, "O Rio nunca esquece." The river never forgets, and no one knew who carved it. But the handwriting, small, deliberate, precise, matched the entries of an old ledger found decades later in the cellar of a Charleston townhouse. The ledger contained hundreds of names, all written in the same careful script. At the bottom of the last page there was no signature, only a symbol, a single flame drawn beside a river. Historians tried to dismiss it as myth. Colonial records mentioned nothing of her. But folklore scholars noted something strange. In every oral version of the tale, from Carolina to Louisiana, the details remained the same. The woman, the furnace, the branded table, the whisper of a river that never sleeps. Even now, locals say that when the tide is low and the night wind moves inland, you can hear her voice. Not angry, not mourning, but reciting. Names, just names. And somewhere, beneath the weight of centuries, the river carries them still. By the time the sun rose over Blackvale, the town had changed. The sheriff's men kept their distance from the old chapel now, though no one could explain why. They said the air there felt wrong, heavier somehow, like the ground itself was holding its breath. The Reverend's wife, who had once tended the gardens outside the chapel, was seen wandering the fields at night, barefoot, muttering to someone who wasn't there. When asked, she'd say, "He's not gone yet." None of them are. No one knew what she meant. Inside the chapel, dust clung to every pew. The altar was cracked. The candles melted into ghostly shapes. But beneath the wooden floorboards, there was something else. The caretaker, a man named Ellis Crow, had taken it upon himself to repair the rot. He lifted the first board one morning, expecting mold or mice. Instead, he found soil packed with fragments of something pale. He brushed it off gently, squinting in the dim light. Bone. Small, delicate, too small for an animal. He froze. Then, from somewhere below, A sound rose up, not loud, not human, just a faint hum, a vibration that seemed to seep from the ground itself. Ellis dropped the board and stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't go to the sheriff. Instead, he nailed the floor shut and never returned. But rumors spread fast in small towns. By the week's end, boys dared each other to peek through the chapel windows at night. They claimed they saw a dim glow, a red pulse under the altar, like a heartbeat beneath the wood. And then the dreams began. Dozens of townsfolk reported the same nightmare. Standing in that chapel, surrounded by whispers, a voice calling from beneath the floor, saying, "Set me free." It was always the same voice, always the same name. When Reverend Cole's ledger was finally recovered from his abandoned home, the last entry chilled everyone who read it. The ink was smeared, the writing shaky, but the words were clear enough to make even the sheriff's hand tremble. "The child is not at rest. I buried him where God cannot see." The townspeople decided to burn the chapel. But fire can't burn what refuses to die. The flames caught, yes, the roof caved in. Yet when the smoke cleared, the altar still stood. The boards around it blackened, but unbroken. And from that day forward, every October, a low hum returns to Blackvale's valley. No one dares to approach the ruins anymore, not even in daylight. Because those who do hear the same voice whisper from the earth, "You know my name." The ruins of the chapel stood for decades. Blackened ribs of timber, half buried under creeping vines. Locals avoided that road altogether. Even travelers, unaware of the stories, felt something when they passed. Horses would snort and refuse to move forward. Engines would sputter. Lights would flicker. No one lived within a mile radius of that place. Not until 1923. That's when the Holloway family arrived. A young couple, Robert and Clara, with their newborn son. They bought the land cheap, believing the tales were nothing more than backwoods superstition. The old chapel, they decided, could be cleared away to build their new home. The first few weeks were uneventful. The air smelled of cedar and rain. Robert worked the soil each morning, and Clara hung laundry where the chapel once stood. They laughed about the rumors, about the ghostly hum and the cursed altar. But laughter can't protect you from history. It started with the baby. Clara said he would wake every night at the same hour, 3:07 a.m., crying uncontrollably. When she picked him up, his skin felt cold, damp with sweat. She'd rock him until dawn, whispering prayers she hadn't said since she was a girl. Robert tried to comfort her, but he began noticing strange things too. Tools he'd left in the shed were moved by morning. Freshly dug earth near the back of the property. And once, just once, he saw small footprints in the mud, leading away from the old chapel's foundation. Child-sized, barefoot. But here's where the story darkens. Neighbors claimed they often heard lullabies drifting across the Holloway property at night. Not sung exactly, more like hummed low and rhythmically. The sound carried on the wind, sometimes even through the walls of nearby houses, and no one could tell where it came from. Then one morning, Robert found the family's dog dead on the porch. Its body untouched, no wounds, no signs of struggle, but its eyes wide open, glassy, fixed toward the ruins of the chapel. Clara begged him to leave. Robert refused. He said he wouldn't be chased off by stories. But stories have roots, and the deeper they're buried, the more dangerous they become. That same week, Clara fell ill. She said she could hear someone talking through the floorboards at night. A young boy's voice, whispering things she couldn't quite make out. Until one night, she did. He said her name. Clara. She froze. The next morning, Robert found her outside in her nightgown, kneeling in the mud beside the ruins. She was digging with her bare hands. When he tried to pull her away, she fought him, screaming that she needed to find the rest of him. He took her inside, locked the doors, and sat awake all night by the fire. That's when he heard it too. The hum. Soft at first, like the sound of bees trapped inside the walls. But then it grew deeper, vibrating through the floor, through his chest. He grabbed his lantern and followed it. All the way to the cellar door. When he opened it, the humming stopped. Total silence. He stepped down the creaking stairs, his light swaying across the dirt walls. Then he saw it. The earth near the far corner had been disturbed, freshly turned. Something buried there. He dropped to his knees and brushed the soil away, his hands shaking. First came the old wood of a broken box, then a scrap of fabric, then something pale beneath the dirt. Not bone this time, but porcelain. A doll's face. He exhaled, half laughing at his fear. But when he lifted it fully from the ground, he saw something carved into its neck. A name, roughly etched into the clay, Cole. Robert stumbled backward. His lantern flickered once, then went out. When light returned, dawn was breaking. Clara was gone. Her footprints led to the same corner of the cellar and vanished. No other prints leaving, no sign of struggle. Just one set, ending in the dirt. Robert Holloway was found 3 days later, wandering the woods barefoot, muttering the same words again and again. He's not buried. He's waiting. The authorities boarded up the property. The town changed hands, new families moved in, and the Holloway name faded from memory. But every few decades, when someone gets the idea to rebuild on that land, the same thing happens. The soil turns black and something hums beneath it. Locals call it the curse of the boy in the soil, and they say, if you ever find yourself driving past the old Blackvale Road late at night, turn off your engine and listen, because sometimes the ground still breathes. The year was 1954 when someone finally decided to look deeper into the Holloway case. A young historian named Marion Dwyer had been researching unsolved disappearances in Mississippi for a university project. The Holloway story caught her attention immediately. A family that vanished, a property abandoned, and a trail of rumors spanning almost a century. Marion wasn't a believer in ghosts. She believed in patterns. She started by visiting the county archives, where most of the old records were crumbling, eaten away by time and humidity. It was there, buried among tax receipts and baptism lists, that she found something strange. A ledger from 1857 that bore the name Reverend Silas Cole. Half the ink was faded, but what survived was enough to chill her blood. The Reverend had meticulously recorded everything. Every donation, every baptism, every funeral. And then, suddenly, near the end of the book, the tone shifted. The child is unholy. He speaks in dreams. He remembers things he should not know. I fear I've buried something more than flesh. Marion read those lines aloud, her voice echoing in the dusty archive room. The handwriting grew more frantic with each entry until the final page was nearly illegible. Only one phrase stood clear, pressed hard into the paper. He must never wake. Marion copied every note, packed her bag, and drove straight to Blackvale. Why then? The old Holloway property was nothing but rotted timber and weeds. Locals warned her to stay away, especially after sunset. The sheriff, a man named Garrett, told her the same story everyone did. It's cursed land. People go missing there. We don't talk about it. But Marion wasn't afraid. She was determined to uncover what the Reverend had done. She spent the day mapping the ruins, marking where the chapel once stood. The foundation stones were still visible, and beneath them, she found remnants of brick and charred wood. When night came, she camped near the site. Notebook in hand, lantern flickering beside her. 3:07 a.m. Her pen rolled off the page. The ground beneath her trembled, softly at first, then with a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. She held her breath. The sound wasn't from the trees or the wind. It was coming from below. She grabbed her lantern, followed the vibration toward the old well behind the ruins. The cover was half broken, wood splintered, and something cold was seeping from it. A faint mist, rising like breath in winter air. Marion leaned closer. For a moment, she swore she heard weeping. A child's voice. Then something else, words, faint but clear enough to make her step back. He put me here. The voice was so soft she almost convinced herself it was the wind. Almost. Marion returned to town the next morning, pale, shaken, but resolute. She sought out church records, hoping to find any mention of a child linked to Reverend Cole. There was only one. Elias Cole, age 9. Deceased. 1857. No cause of death listed. No burial record either. The Reverend had a son. Marion's mind raced. The journal entries, the whispers, the boy beneath the floorboards, it all fit. Reverend Cole hadn't just buried something. He'd buried his own child. But why? She drove back to the site that evening, unable to resist the pull of it. The well seemed deeper than before, the mist thicker. She lowered a rope light into the shaft, her hands trembling as she watched the glow descend 10 feet. 20. 30. Then the rope went slack. Something below had tugged it. Marion tried to pull it back up, but it wouldn't budge. Instead, the light flickered, then began to move. Not upward, not downward, but in slow, deliberate circles. She froze. A moment later, the light shot back up the rope, swinging wildly before slamming into the edge of the well. The bulb shattered, plunging everything into darkness. From below, the weeping returned. Louder this time. Closer. "Help me!" Marion stumbled back, heart pounding. But before she could run, she noticed something glowing faintly in the mud near her feet. She knelt and brushed it aside. A small wooden cross, carved crudely, with the initials EC. She pocketed it and fled. Back at her motel, she couldn't sleep. The cross sat on the nightstand, and the air around it felt colder, heavier. Just after 3 a.m., the radio turned on by itself. A static hum filling the room, followed by the faint sound of a child's laughter. When Marion returned to the well the next day, the cross was gone. But on the side of the stone rim, freshly carved, were new words. "He's awake." That was the last entry in her field journal. A local farmer found her car still parked near the property 2 days later. Her tent was empty, her lantern cold. They never found her body. Sheriff Garrett filed the report, sealed it, and the case faded, like all the others. But one thing remained. The townsfolk said that after Marion vanished, the hum from beneath the chapel stopped. The nightmares ceased. Even the mist around the well disappeared. For the first time in more than a century, Black Veil was silent. Until the summer of 1986, a construction crew, clearing land for a new road, unearthed what appeared to be the remnants of a cellar. Inside, they found 2 things. A cracked porcelain doll with the name Cole still faintly etched on its neck, and a human skull, small, delicate, child-sized. The discovery in 1986 should have been routine. A highway expansion crew was digging through an overgrown stretch of Black Veil, the kind of place where the forest had long since reclaimed the land. They had no idea they were cutting straight through the old coal property. No one had lived there for nearly a century. It was early morning when the first shovel hit something solid. At first, the men thought it was a tree root. But when they brushed away the soil, a faint, pale curve emerged. It wasn't wood. It wasn't stone. It was bone. The sheriff at the time, the grandson of the original Garrett, was called in immediately. He sealed off the site, ordered the crew to stop work until forensic teams could arrive. But the men had already dug too far. They found the small skull first, then a few scattered ribs, and then, about a foot deeper, something that didn't belong. A doll's head cracked clean down the middle, with one glass eye still in place. And there was something else. The soil around the remains was warm. Not sun-warmed, not surface heat, but warm from within, as if the earth itself were breathing. The medical examiner confirmed later that the bones were cold to the touch when handled, but at the site, everyone swore the air shimmered like heat rising from asphalt. The sheriff ordered the remains packed for analysis. But as the crew lifted the skull into the evidence case, a sharp noise split the air. Not thunder, not machinery. It was a low hum, steady and deep, vibrating through the ground like the echo of a buried bell. Every man on that site froze, and then the generator died. One of the workers, a man named Harlan Price, would later tell reporters that, for just a second, the air around him moved. Not wind, but a pull, as if something unseen had exhaled. He dropped his flashlight, and when he picked it up again, the dirt beside the open pit had shifted. Footprints. Bare, small, leading away. The sheriff dismissed it as hysteria, refused to file it in the report. But that night, Harlan Price went missing. His truck was still parked at the motel, keys inside, engine cold. No signs of struggle, just an empty bed and an open window. Over the next week, 2 more men from the crew quit and left town without collecting their pay. One sent a letter later saying he couldn't sleep without hearing the sound. The excavation was shut down. The bones were quietly transferred to the state lab for examination. That's where things got even stranger. The skull, originally catalogued and sealed in a sterile case, vanished overnight. Security footage from the lab showed nothing. No intruders, no staff entering the room. One moment the box was there. The next, it wasn't. What they did find, however, was far worse. Someone or something had written on the inside of the glass display where the skull had been. Finger marks in condensation, forming 3 words, "He's still here." The lab shut the case down immediately, citing clerical error and atmospheric contamination. But the state examiner who handled the remains resigned 2 days later. His resignation letter was 1 line long. "I heard him whisper my name." After that, no one touched the coal case again. The land was condemned, the construction rerouted. The highway curves awkwardly around that stretch of Blackvale even now, not because of terrain but because no one would agree to dig there again. But every so often, travelers who drive that curve at night report the same thing. Their radios go dead. The engine sputters. And through the static, a faint child's voice can be heard, humming. Always the same tune. Always around 3 a.m. Locals say it's the lullaby Reverend Cole sang the night he buried his son. What they don't know is that the humming never stopped. It's just waiting, buried beneath the soil, patient as the dark. Because in Blackvale, the dead don't rest. They remember. For nearly 40 years, the land around Old Blackvale lay untouched. The highway curved around it like a scar the earth refused to heal. Locals called it the Quiet Mile. People didn't stop there. They didn't even slow down. But in 2022, curiosity returned, not from the town, but from the internet at a small YouTube channel called Southern Haunts, run by 3 friends, Eli, June, and Carson, had built a modest following exploring forgotten ghost towns and abandoned churches. Their videos were usually lighthearted. Creaking doors, shaky flashlights, a few jump scares for clicks. But when a Reddit post mentioned a cursed property in Mississippi where an entire family vanished and a child's voice still hums under the soil, Eli saw potential for their biggest episode yet. They found the location through old land records, a forgotten plot just beyond Highway 47, still marked in faded ink as coal property. 1857 WY late October. They arrived. The forest had swallowed nearly everything. Only fragments of the old foundation remained, and a rusted well cover half buried in weeds. The moment they stepped onto the property, their audio equipment began to crackle. The batteries drained faster than they ever had before. Carson laughed it off. "Classic EMF," he said. "Ghosts love to mess with cameras." But June noticed something else. The air was still, completely still. Not a single bird call. Not even the wind moving through the trees. Just silence. They began filming anyway. Eli narrated, his voice calm and steady, the way he'd practiced dozens of times before. "Behind me lies the ruins of what locals call the Blackvale Chapel. Nearly 2 centuries of superstition surround this land, stories of missing families, unexplained deaths, and a preacher who buried his own son beneath the altar. Tonight, we're going to see what's left. And what still lingers." For the first hour, nothing happened. Their flashlights swept across rotting wood, broken stones, and moss-covered bricks. But then June found something. A piece of porcelain, half buried in the dirt near the well at a doll's face. The crack running down its cheek looked too clean, too fresh. They set up camp just beyond the foundation. June wanted to leave. Eli wanted footage. Carson wanted views. So they stayed. At 3:07 a.m., the equipment turned on by itself. The cameras, all powered down hours earlier, began recording simultaneously. The drone, which hadn't been launched, lifted off the ground and hovered 10 feet in the air. Its lens pointed straight at the old well. The sound followed, low at first, then rising. The same hum that had been reported for more than a century. Steady, rhythmic, vibrating through the soil. June screamed. Carson tried to shut off the cameras, but the buttons wouldn't respond. The drone began to descend slowly, circling the well like it was being guided by something unseen. Eli shouted for them to pack up, but when he turned, June was gone. Her flashlight lay on the ground, beam tilted toward the trees. On the footage recovered later, Her shadow simply fades from view. No movement, no blur, no noise. Just gone. Panic hit. Carson ran for the car. Eli followed, clutching the camera to his chest. When they reached the road, the car doors were open, and the engine was already running. The headlights flickered. Inside, the radio played static. Then, beneath the hiss, came a faint voice, a child's voice. He's awake. The video ends there. 3 days later, police found the car abandoned on Highway 47. Inside were 2 cameras, a cracked phone, and a single piece of paper, a motel receipt signed by E. Cole. Neither Eli nor Carson were ever found. Authorities sealed the footage, calling it a hoax, but snippets leaked online months later. Viewers claimed to hear the hum layered beneath the background noise, and some even said the boy's voice whispered their names through the headphones. You can still find fragments of that video on the dark corners of the web. The file is corrupted, the image warped and flickering, but one frame stands out clearly. A face reflected in the drone's final shot. Not any of the 3 investigators. A boy, maybe 9 years old, standing at the edge of the well, smiling, and behind him, a man in a preacher's collar, his eyes black as the soil. After that footage spread, the forest around Blackvale caught fire twice. No cause ever determined. Locals say the ground still hums beneath the ashes. Others say the hum has spread, carried by the new highway that now runs less than a mile from the site. Truckers passing through at night sometimes report the same thing. Radios dying, mirrors fogging up, a faint child's voice asking, "Can you hear me?" Then silence. But those who stop, those who step out and listen, never make it back to their trucks. The last thing their dashcams record is static, and the sound of dirt shifting beneath the tires. For decades, the stories of Blackvale were little more than local legend, a whispered cautionary tale buried under moss and folklore. But everything changed in 2024, when a journalist named Diana Mercer stumbled onto a box of forgotten evidence inside the old county records office. She hadn't been searching for ghosts. She'd been investigating corruption in the Blackvale Sheriff's Department, tracing property ownership disputes tied to condemned land. But when she opened that box, dust billowed out, along with photographs, missing person reports, and a series of handwritten notes signed Dwyer, 1954. The name caught her attention. She looked it up. Marion Dwyer, the historian who vanished 70 years earlier. Her final note read, "He's not gone. The ground remembers." Diana was intrigued, not because she believed in curses, but because she believed in patterns, the same way Marion once had. She began tracing the timeline. 1857. Reverend Cole's child dies under mysterious circumstances. 1923. The Holloway family disappears. 1954. Marion Dwyer vanishes investigating the Cole property. 1986. Construction crew unearths a child's skull and a porcelain doll. 2022. 3 YouTubers disappear after filming at the site. 5 separate incidents. 5 disappearances. All within the same quarter-mile radius. Diana's curiosity turned to obsession. She spent months cross-referencing property deeds, witness statements, and death records. That's when she noticed something strange. Each generation had one name in common. Someone connected to the local church. 1857. Reverend Silas Cole. 1923. Reverend Edwin Holloway. 1954. Pastor Samuel Garrett. 1986. Chaplain Thomas Price, who blessed the construction site. 2022. And finally, Eli Price, the leader of the Southern Haunts, Team. 5 men. All with church ties. All with bloodlines that traced back to a single surname, Cole. The Reverend's descendants. Every one of them had died or vanished on that same ground. Diana's articles started to gain traction online. The more she published, the more people sent her tips, old maps, diary entries, even an unearthed tape from 1986 that was supposedly recorded by the excavation crew before the site was shut down. The tape ran for exactly 3 minutes and 7 seconds. Most of it was static. But near the end, a voice could be heard whispering, "He buried me alive." Diana tried to isolate the audio. The voice was faint but layered, as though 2 people were speaking at once. One young, one old. She compared the waveform to archived recordings of local clergy from the 1930s and found a partial match: Reverend Edwin Holloway. The same man who'd built his home over the ruins of the old chapel. Diana's investigation drew national attention. She was invited on podcasts and local news, praised for debunking the myths of Black Veil. But off camera, she wasn't so sure anymore. Her phone would ring at exactly 3:07 a.m. every night. No caller ID. No sound on the other end, just a faint vibration, like a hum through metal. Her apartment lights flickered whenever she opened the file containing the Cole family ledger. Sometimes, her laptop speakers would emit a low tone, and words would appear across her screen, auto-typed by something unseen. He never left. You opened the ground. Now you belong here. Diana's colleagues thought she was cracking under the pressure. She stopped sleeping, started recording herself at night, just to prove she wasn't imagining things on one of those recordings. At exactly 3:07, she could be seen sitting upright in bed, eyes open, whispering a lullaby no one had ever taught her. The next morning, she found dirt under her fingernails. That same week, a package arrived at the newsroom addressed to her, with no return address. Inside was a small wooden cross, the same kind Marion Dwyer had once described in her journal. Burned into the wood were 2 letters. Isi. Diana didn't tell anyone. She just packed her things and drove to Mississippi. She arrived at the site 2 days later, now fenced off, overgrown and silent. The trees had thickened around it, their roots curling through the ruins of what once was the chapel floor. In the center, the well still stood, covered in rust and moss. She placed her camera on a tripod, hit record, and began to speak. My name is Diana Mercer. I don't know what I'm looking for. Maybe the truth, maybe closure. I just know this place wants to be found. For the first few minutes, her voice was steady. But as the wind picked up, the audio began to distort. Her image flickered on the screen. Then a sound. The hum, low, rhythmic, coming from beneath the ground. Her camera kept rolling as she approached the well. She leaned in, flashlight trembling, and whispered, Elias. A child's laugh echoed back. Then a second voice, older, rasping, angry, answered, He's mine. The footage ends there. When search teams found her car the next morning, the camera was still recording, battery somehow alive. The final frame showed the well open again with the lid pushed aside. Around its rim were fresh handprints, small ones pressed deep into the mud. The police sealed the site. The footage was never released publicly. But the newsroom received one last email from Diana's account 2 days later. No subject line, no message, just a video file attached. It was only 7 seconds long. The frame showed her face, half-lit, whispering something. Audio filters couldn't make it out clearly, but technicians agreed on one phrase. He's not buried anymore. And then silence. After that, the hum returned to Black Veil. Travelers passing the quiet mile began reporting it again. The radio interference, the flickering lights, the child's voice. Local authorities closed the stretch of highway for repairs. But those who live nearby say that late at night, you can still see the glow of a lantern deep among the trees. Some claim it's Diana. Others say it's the boy. But the old folks in town, they say something different. They say Reverend Cole finally found what he was looking for and brought it back. 6 months after Diana Mercer vanished, her story became a digital ghost of its own. News channels moved on. Podcasts dramatized it. The Southern Haunts subreddit exploded with theories, everything from ancient cults to government cover-ups. But deep in the noise, one post stood out. A user named archivist_07 uploaded a short clip titled, Black Veil, What They Didn't Show You. The clip was grainy, timestamped March 7, 2024. The same day Diana disappeared. It began with her camera rolling, static fading in and out. The view shifted as if someone else had picked it up. A man's breathing could be heard, shaky, uneven. He whispered, She's gone. The ground took her. Then, a glimpse of the well, and inside it, a light. Not a reflection, not fire, something alive. The screen went black. Viewers debated it endlessly. Was it real? Edited? AI-generated? But what caught the attention of federal investigators wasn't the light. It was the metadata. The file wasn't uploaded from Mississippi. It was uploaded from within the servers of a small local news station. the same one Diana had worked for. Someone or something had used her login credentials 6 months after her disappearance. When authorities arrived to search the newsroom, they found Diana's office sealed off. The computers were cold, the room dusty, except for one thing. Her monitor was on. The cursor blinked over an empty document titled, "The Well That Never Closes." The words appeared one by one, typed by no visible hands. Every story opens the ground. Every voice feeds the echo. Every listener is a door. Then the screen cracked. Not shattered, cracked from the inside. The investigation stopped there, but the digital trail didn't. Weeks later, strange anomalies began appearing online. Corrupted files, looping sounds embedded in YouTube documentaries, static bursts hidden in podcasts about the case. And every time someone played them, the same low hum emerged, 3:07 a.m. frequency. Audio engineers tried to isolate it, calling it the black veil tone. They said it wasn't random noise, it was a pattern, identical to a heartbeat. When played backward, it formed words. The translation varied by software, but one phrase appeared in nearly every version: "He's awake." Meanwhile, the land around Black Veil changed. The soil grew soft, as if breathing. New sinkholes appeared where the old chapel once stood, swallowing trees whole. Animals avoided the area, but night wanderers said they could hear hymns carried through the fog, sung in a child's voice. Locals began boarding up their windows again. Some left town altogether. Others stayed, claiming that if they kept their radios tuned to the static, the hum wouldn't enter their homes. But nothing could stop the dreams. Everyone who'd watched the original footage, the YouTubers, the journalists, the engineers, reported the same recurring nightmare. A boy standing at the end of their bed, whispering a prayer that ends in a scream. When they woke, there'd be mud on their sheets. The final documented case came from Detective Harris, the officer who'd led the initial investigation into Diana's disappearance. He'd refused to talk to the press for months. Then one day, he sent an email to his precinct with a single attachment. A voice recording, and in it, he spoke calmly, his tone almost relieved. "I've been hearing him for weeks. I tried to ignore it. The hum, the voice, it's in everything. My phone, the walls, even the water in the sink. He doesn't want justice. He wants to be remembered. He wants stories." There was a pause. Then, "He says when people stop telling it, he'll sleep again." The recording ended with that same hum, faint but constant. Harris disappeared the next day. Authorities sealed off Black Veil permanently. The land was declared toxic and condemned, fenced with warning signs that read, "No entry, subsurface instability." But the fence didn't stop the stories. Every few months, a new video surfaces online. Grainy clips showing the well, or what's left of it. Each video ends the same way: a static burst, a flash of light, and a child's laugh echoing through the dark. The latest clip, uploaded just last week, appeared on a new channel, no profile picture, no description, just a black thumbnail with white text. "The Black Veil Reverend speaks again." The video opens to the sound of breathing. Then, a voice, low and distorted. "You came to hear my sermon, so listen closely. The earth remembers every name that falls into it, and now, it knows yours." The screen fades to static. But if you pause it at exactly 3:07, a faint reflection can be seen in the background. A woman's silhouette holding a camera. Diana Mercer? And she's smiling. Narrator tone fades out. Final line: "Some places never die. They just wait for someone to listen again." So if you ever find yourself driving through Mississippi, and you see a dead stretch of road with no lights, no signs, and a fog that seems to move on its own, keep driving. And whatever you do, don't stop when the radio hums.